Hey everybody, welcome to this episode of TRCOA's Behind the Groove. If you're here live, please introduce yourself and ask questions in the chat as we go along. This episode is sponsored by TRCOA Studios. Also, if you find this content useful, please like this video, and if you are new, please subscribe to our channel. We make new content every week. Today we are proud to have Ben Kliever. He's going to do a tutorial on the best ways to mix bass. Ben is the owner of Nebula 88 Studios and one of TRCOA's beginning recording techniques instructors. Without further ado, Ben Kliever.
Hey everyone, welcome back to TRCOA's Behind the Groove seminar. I am Ben Kliever and I will be leading the lesson tonight. And tonight we are going to be talking about bass guitar and specifically just about mixing bass guitar and some approaches you can take to working with it. So, hey Errol, welcome, good to see you in there. So that's what we're going to be going over today is we're going to be focusing on bass and how I would approach mixing it. We're going to be looking at a little bit different setting than the one we did before. So just to kind of talk about how I recorded the bass first before we really go into like all the mixing kind of stuff, we'll talk about that a little bit. So for those of you who have heard me talk about it on bass, a lot of bass these days is done by DI, and what DI stands for is direct input. And so a lot of bass these days is coming straight in through the preamp or actually going through an actual DI box that they're playing through. Now, some people still do like to record with an amp. Sometimes it's getting less common just because you can get such good tones straight out of the DI and it really holds down the low end very well with how clear and clean everything is when you do direct input with bass, and then you can color it however you want afterwards, which is how, like again, how I said, majority of bass is done in these times. So that's what we're going to be listening to here on this DI, in this bass, is a straight up DI track. Hey there, everybody. Hi, Courtney. Hi, Corey. Hey, everybody. Welcome to the seminar. So this is going to be a DI track that we're going to be starting with. So we're going to look at how I would approach this track alone by itself, and then some other parallel processing you can do depending on what your thought process is and what you're trying to do for the song. Remember, anything we're always talking about, because it's in one song, you may do something slightly different in how you treat it for another song, so just always keep that in mind whenever you're going there. Hey there, Alec. Howdy, Josh. Welcome, everybody. And so that's what, just keep that in mind when I'm talking about the other processes here. So DI, main way, if you are using a bass cab, then you can mic it with that. Great ones you can use with that are good mics for those are any ones that you use for kick mics, whether that be D112s, Beta 52s, whichever option you have to do low end on those are always great. RE20s are also very good for putting on bass, and you can even use a 57 on bass if you really need to. And then I would still take the DI along with it if you are tracking the amp, because if the amp doesn't end up working or you need to blend more of the signal with the amp to make it feel fuller, you can certainly do that. Or if you decide you just completely want to do it all in the box once you have the performance from the DI, then you can do that as well. So that's just a few different things that to take into account, just depending on how you're recording that. I just wanted to kind of give a little preface on that, even though it's not what our main lesson is going to be about tonight. So bass overview in general, when we're talking about bass guitar, it is a rhythm instrument. It's really something that locks in a lot with the drums. For those of you who are not familiar, the bass is really following a lot of what the kick is doing. It also, to some extent, is definitely going to be following what the guitar is doing chord-wise, depending on that. Now, different sections will obviously require different things, but just in general, bass is a rhythm instrument, and its main goal is to hold down the rhythm in the low end area, because guitars aren't super low end, and you do get low end out of the kick drum for sure. There's no doubt about that. But then the rest of that part you need to be filled with the low end to make the rest of the song feel bigger. That's what a bass guitar is going to be filling in it there. So another thing I want you to think about is this song's a little bit more relaxed in kind of how it is. So I'll show you how to make something be more aggressive, but in the end, that's not going to be the bass tone I'm going for with this. So just remember, every project you go into, anything you're working on, think about what the song needs and what the end goal of that song is, and not just I'm going to use the same technique every time that I might use on a heavy song compared to a light song, or a funk song compared to a metal song, like, so do keep that in mind of what the genre kind of calls for, because something in a more distorted genre is not going to fit in something that's more clean. So always keep that in mind and say, hey there, Michaela, welcome. So that is the bass in general. So here we're going to take a listen to just a little section of this here. I have actually made this bass completely raw. This is just how it was recorded. So we're going to go through all the way from step 1 going through there. So this is just a little bit of what the instrumental is happening here. Cool, so that's just a little quick listen to what's going on here. Now I just wanted you to hear the bass by itself as well too. So this is recorded straight up DI, so this is what that tone is coming through, his bass directly in there. So this is kind of be taking you from step 1, kind of how I would approach this bass from this point, once I've done any cuts or editing I need to do, and then we're going into the mix. Now obviously this other stuff is mixed already, which normally I would start with drums and then go into bass, but so that's why some other things. So we'll probably focus on that a little bit too as we're bringing this in with our levels and all that kind of balance. So before we dive in, and actually, I'll talk about that once we get to. I'll go ahead and just kind of talk about the overall EQs and then double back on that, because just kind of in general, if you're looking, I'll just kind of open up an EQ here just so you can see frequency ranges here. So you can see this is going all the way up to 100, 200, 200 to 1,000 right here, 1 to 2K, and then you can see it's 2K to 5K, 5K to 10K, 10K to 20K. So each frequency range gets a little tighter as it goes up higher because there's more information in the low end. So in general, for bass, when you're talking about the low end that it's handling, that you're going to be using a bass guitar for the most part, it's going to be between 50 and 100 hertz. So this is kind of the area that you're looking at right here when you're talking about the low end of bass. When we're talking about the next step up, which is the 100 to 250 range, this is where you get a lot of the tone and the roundness of the bass. Like this is definitely an area where you're gonna feel, a little bit more control of what the actual sound of the bass is. And if you want a little more, this will still add beef. Obviously, this is adding like super low end down here when you're doing the 50 to 100. But then the 100 to 120 here is where it's going to be a little more tone. And when I say tone, it's that you're going to actually hear it change the kind of timbre of the instrument. Where down here, this is something where you're more going to feel it less. Like you'll still hear it obviously, but it's not going to be tone changing. It's something more you're going to feel that low hit, where this is going to be more defining, what part of the bass that you're hearing and what sound that's coming through. Now the next section up is 250 to about 800, and this is going to be our kind of mud and boxiness kind of area. There's typically going to be a little spot that you'll likely want to cut out there, because around or up above that in that area, there's just really not a lot of useful content in a bass in that 250 to 800 area, where other instruments are taking up those ranges. So we're really getting low end and tone right here from this area, and then here the next big part up, and we'll see this when we actually go in an EQ. I just kind of want y'all to see these ranges already before I'm really diving into that. And then up here we have more to the 1 to 2.5K area here, which is going to be like right in this kind of area, and this is really going to handle the presence and kind of attitude of the bass right here. So this is once you've kind of dialed in this low area, this area is going to be, more deciding how much you really want that bass to poke through how the mix is. There may be some mixes where the bass really is just there to be felt and really just to accentuate everything else in there. And in other mixes, depending on the song, there may be fills and runs and stuff that you really want that bass to be sticking through. And this is an area where this 1 to 2.5K range where you can get a little more point going through there. But make sure when you're mixing these in, it's something you're mixing in, with the other instruments, so you're not going overboard with that. So you always want to check where these things are sitting with the rest of the instruments in the mix. And then lastly, after that, in like the 5K to 8K range, this is just like the super brightness if you need to bring up any more brightness in that kind of area up in this high part. So that's kind of our frequency ranges, 50 to 100 low end, 100 to 250. This is our tone and roundness. 250 to 800 is our mud and boxy area where we're likely going to need to do a cut or two. If we need to add more presence and more point, that's going to be in the 1K to 2.5K range. And then if we need more brightness or just kind of more air in that kind of scenario, it's more the 5 to 8K range. Really above 8K, there's really not anything left on a bass that's really going to be happening. So here's actually us just looking at this bass performance in a spectrum analyzer where all we're doing here is just looking at exactly the frequencies. You can see there's almost, when you hit some of these high notes, you see some jumps up here in 5K a little bit, but there's nothing happening by about this 8K range that I was talking about there. There's not too much information really going on, but all the strong information is the low end down here in the 50, and then the roundness part down here in this 250 part there. So that is just EQ overview for you guys right there to kind of just take in stock and then those are notes that you can do generally, those frequency ranges generally to any genre, and they will apply in those frequency ranges where what the generalizations are there. Okay, so now that we have talked about our bass, the next thing I want to do is how we want to route these. I'm going to end up adding more bass in there, so we'll talk about routing, but what we're going to end up doing is anything that I'm making on bass, unless there's an unbelievably specific reason that you need to go into a stereo track, I'm going to bus any basses and any parallel basses I have into a mono bus. And I'm going to do that here in a second, and then we'll once I make the duplicate, just so you can see where it's all going. So at this point, if I was only going to use one bass channel and you're going to do all your processing on this, then there's not really too much reason to send it into a bus if you're only going to use a single bass, which some tracks you may end up doing that. You go through and mix the track that you have, and it's a very more sparse open song, and you may not have to do all that kind of stuff. But so now let's go ahead and let's dive into going into the bass and how I would approach this, though, just starting with just this single bass track. So the first thing I'm going to do is that I have a DI is I want to get something to make this feel a little bit more like a real amp, which is what I was talking about with the DI. And one thing that is great that is built right into Pro Tools for you is the Sans Amp. It acts like the Sans Amp pedal that's made directly for bass and DIing bass. And so let's go find that. I believe it should be in harmonic. And there it is, the Sans Amp PSA1. And this is going to kind of look like the controls you would have on an amp here, on an actual amp. So we have like the preamp, buzz, punch, crunch, drive, low, high, and our level. And we're just going to take a little listen so y'all can hear kind of what these different knobs are doing and how they're controlling, and then we're going to dial this bass in for this track. So here's what the bass sounds like without it even on. Let me go ahead and go to the chorus where he's doing a little more stuff. So it's already kind of controlling that a little bit. So now I'm going to go in and we're going to kind of really get this a little more dialed in how I want it to be. Just like I'm looking at this right here, like I'm dialing this in like almost a little bit before in there, because I know what I want this bass to sound like, and then I'll pull everything in with it. So this is how hard I'm actually driving the bass into the preamp here. You can hear, like, as I really push it up here, it starts really driving what's going on in it. Okay, so now this right here is gonna really control some of the brightness in this too. This buzz, you'll actually hear it's gonna add actual buzz in there. And on this, I'm actually, where it softens it that way and it makes it more intense this way. You can see how much this is actually even adding onto our track here with how much volume we have going on. So usually it's something we kind of want to level match a little bit. So now with this buzz, with how this is, I'm gonna kind of make it a little softer. So with the drums in there. Let me take the drums back out so we can just focus on what these sounds are doing here. So we have punch. Which makes the bass feel a little punchier, which I do want to do that, but with the buzz, it's making it a little like clicky. And with what this song is, it already kind of has this kind of like classic feel a little bit to it. So my goal in the end of this is to make this bass be a little bit smoother, where it's not quite as crunchy as maybe I might use in a more rockin' track, but you can see how easily just using some of these tracks, like some of these knobs, can get you driven really quick. But we're gonna use another thing that I would use to drive a little more distortion into it. Then you actually have crunch knob here. Then we actually have a real drive knob here, which actually, you can hear it almost like fuzz and kind of break up on the bass. Which I already kind of said, my goal with this was to kind of make this a little bit smoother. And these two, as you would expect, the low end here is going to control more bass and more low end in it, and the high end's gonna give you a little more high end and a little more of that presence. So like this is like cutting low out at that point, then on this side we're pushing it, so we want to give this bass a little low end. So just tone-wise, we can already see, like, so now this is feeling more like a bass amp. We're gonna go do some more stuff right after this, but. It's fuller. It does sound like it's coming out of an amp. We have much more low end, we have much more presence, and we have a bit more saturation going on here, which saturation is something we want to be wary, we definitely want to do on bass, because the more, like when you saturate bass, which saturation is adding some type of fuzz or distortion, or actually saturation is a type of, you can get saturation from consoles, from tubes, from tapes, any of that kind of stuff can also give you saturation, like along with fuzz pedals, overdrive pedals, distortion pedals. But when you add a little saturation on bass, what it helps do is it helps cut the bass through on smaller speakers like phones or laptops, where the low end might not be able to be felt because there's no sub there, and it's not really good to have like a bunch of bass kicking on one of these, like on a laptop or on your phone. And so this actually gives a little more like oomph in that higher, in that 100 to 300 hertz kind of area, so it cuts and pushes through a little bit more. So usually the next thing I do after I'm using, now I like the Sans amp. You could also use any other, you could use any other amp sim that you have. In Overloud, if you have the newest version of it, which up here I don't have the most recent version of it, there is two different amp models in there that are underneath the Slate, underneath the rig player with the Slate package, and it's a Eden and it has an SVT. But this, I mean, and there's a basement in there, but I mean, every time I go in there, this is almost like a go-to, because it just ends up sounding sounding better than using the stock thing in here sometimes. So it's something that I really like to do on that, but you can absolutely use any bass cab amp sim you want. And if you're spending more than 5 or 10 minutes trying to dial in a bass amp sim and it's not sounding good, then it's probably just not the input or the amp sim that you need to be using for that scenario, because it should be something you should be able to get in pretty quick and a little bit quicker on there. But now besides talking amp sims, we'll go ahead and move on from there. The next thing I usually am doing here is now I kind of want to control the low end, give it a little more analog feel. So here I'm going to go in and I'm going to add tape machine in here. And I do want to saturate this a little bit, so I'm going to I'm gonna push this a little bit. Not that much, but on this, I'm trying to push it where I'm kind of tapping like right into the 0 to 1 range, like right in this 1 to 1 range here, where this is -1 below this. So I'm getting saturation from it, but I'm not overloading the tape machine with how hard I'm pushing it. We'll stay on 3. I think that'll probably be. And now over here we do have some other settings that we can control. So we have like a bias setting here if we want it to focus more on the high end than like just normal where it's doing both, or focusing on the low end. And on this scenario, let's take a listen. And usually on bass, when I'm dealing with just the individual bass track with a tape machine on here, I'm usually, a lot of times I'm picking the low end here because it's gonna tighten that low end up a lot. And over here too, this is something you can decide on this. Usually 15 amps does push low end a little bit more, but it does add a little bit more, just a little bit more, you know, noise to it slightly. It's something you're not really gonna, I mean, it's very subtle, but that's just a little bit of the difference that you can. So what it's doing is it's beefing up my low end a little bit, giving me just a little bit more thickness on here. Yeah, feel free to ask questions, guys, as I'm going along. So if there's any question or comment you want to make as you're listening, then please do. So here's with it out, here's with it back in. Okay, so usually now that I've gone in, I've got my amp sim set here with my Sans amp, really got my tone dialed in more, and now I have my low end dialed in more. And this is the next thing we're going to kind of do is so the next thing we're going to do from here now is we're going to really get into our processing a little bit more. And we're really going to dive into our chain here with the virtual mix rack. So let's go ahead and I'm going to go in here. One of the first things I like to do on any of these type tracks is I like using the virtual channel here. So let's really drive in. So I'm always trying to control this stuff unless there's a reason I'm really trying to overload it. But you know, pay attention to your meters on these when you're using these tools, because it's like if you're up here in the red, this is legitimately saying you're in the red. This is acting like an analog VU meter and telling you how hard the signal that you are sending on that track is going into this console emulation here. Because if I push it this way, you can see, you know, now it's clipping and driving it too hard in there. And I like how clean the API is, just so, like I've talked about this before, but both these are these Brit 4Ks, these are SSLs, this is an API, this is a Neve, this is a Trident, and then this is like a custom tube style that they made for their plugin. So this just gives it a little more color and life to it. Because you got to think also, when you're bringing a DI in, a DI, no matter what, even though it does come through super clean and we get all the frequency ranges and everything's there that we need, you know, DIs do, no matter what, kind of have this dull sound to them a little bit. So the more that we can kind of liven them up with using tape machines and using some console emulations and things to make it feel like it's getting more beefed up, then those are always good moves. So now that I have gone through and done that, we're going to listen to, I'm going to bring my drums back in with this, and I'm going to pull out the SSL EQ here. And then we're going to kind of tone shape this a little bit more, so we can keep in mind those frequencies we were talking about earlier. So we're adding in a bunch of low end right there. I'm gonna try to get a little more, you know, a little more presence cutting through. I mean, on this one I'm EQing, I'm trying to hear it with other stuff. So this is, you know, this is why I'm EQing with it, and then we'll do like an A-B afterwards. Kind of looking, now I'm kind of sweeping for the frequencies I want to cut, which I don't really like how that's. Okay, so now that I've kind of made some moves here, and you can see I'm doing that with the other instruments engaged, because if you're just EQing soloed by itself, you know, I mean, to some extent you can get to some like minor movement stuff, but you're always going to need to hear your instruments in context to be able to get them to fit with everything else that you have going on in the mix. So I've controlled this low end a little bit too. So what I've done here is I'm using a low cut filter here, because I mean, I don't really need, I mean, again, I've talked with y'all a lot, like there's almost nothing that you're gonna really ever need below 35 Hertz. On this, sometimes I'll even pull these up higher if it's for sure a song where the kick drum is gonna be the low end. There's times I'll high pass this up in this type of rock where it's even 60 to 80 Hertz in this kind of area right here on the bass, because then it's letting my kick handle that super low end down there, which with the big bottom, and then I'm letting the actual thump and everything coming from the bass up here. Now this is right around 125. I'm using a shelf here. You can also use a bell if you need to, but. So there's my bass without the EQ. And then right here, this is where I decided I was listening for kind of where I just heard like the nasally stuff that I didn't want from the bass. So like. So I'm just kind of taking that kind of harsh stuff out, making that a little bit smoother. And then I was bringing a little bit of presence back here, right around that 1 to 1.5K range. You always want to be careful too, just thinking about this too, like in the 2 to 3K range, that's where a lot of vocals and stuff's happening, that's where a lot of things are happening. So just make sure that whenever you're pushing in those areas, you're not overloading it on everything in that spot. Do you have a preference? Corey's asking me, do you have a preference in simulation on the VCC? So on this, I actually use a lot of these different ones on here. So the API, to me personally, on this one, I picked it because I want this track to be very clean. The Neves up here is going to be like the most gritty, kind of broken up, most punchy, like the most punchy one that's on here, just because of how the Neve is. But the API is very clean in that same kind of respect, where the Neve gets a little grittier. The SSLs here are very clean. You can hear how this one's actually a little bit darker, the G series over the E series, and then the API is up here. So Corey's like, Corey, on this, I'm picking this VCC each time depending on what the instrument is doing and what the song is doing. Like a lot of times, like on drums, I'm going with APIs or Neves almost majority of the time, because APIs are great for drums. I mean, it's almost like they're so good at transients, but so are Neves, but Neves are just a little bit grittier, and so they add a little bit more flavor to it, where the API is a little cleaner. The Trident here, this is one I like to use on vocals sometimes, and then the tube is only going to be if you're wanting to really make something be a little bit thicker or more analog, or really get kind of more of that like thick tubey sound to it. But again, these are pretty subtle, but that's the thought process that I'm using when I'm looking at these. It's always going to be the style of what I'm working on at that time, and then what is the sound of what instrument it's on, and what's the sound I'm trying to get out of that. So that's just kind of what I'm thinking about on those fronts over here. Obviously, you do have a drive knob down here in the VCC that you can push harder on here. So there's just the VCC channel, and our EQ, you can already hear it's moving our bass, feels like it's a lot more in our face. So if you are welcome, Corey, if there's any other questions on that, just please follow up on that if there's something else you wanted me to clarify with those. Now, after I'm doing my EQ, like this EQ, and I've got a little coloration going on here. Now this is where I'm going to go do my work with the compressor. I do like the 1176s. This is an 1176 clone on here. I do like the 1176s on bass. They're really good on bass. They're really great on vocals too. They're good on drum rooms. This is the standard like Blackie version. This is the modern version, which is one that Slate kind of made their own. It's like a higher grit version of the 1176. And then this is the vintage one that they kind of call the bluey. Like if you've seen traditional ones, these are like the two traditional ones. You have the black face, and then you have the blue face that they call these two. And this one's a little bit grittier, and this one's a little bit smoother compared to those two. But they're both very similar. So I'm going to start with the traditional version right here, and dial in the preamp here on this. So at first on this, I mean, my bass take, you can kind of see this was a pretty, like this guy has a pretty smooth bass take. It's not too jumpy. You can, if you decide you want to, you could we could use a quicker compressor like a VCA in there. We'll talk about that here in a minute. I'm just going to dial in this first main compressor, and then get that set so we can have this feeling like it's going a little more, coming more out. And now this might be something too, whenever I'm doing these compressors, you know, where I might lightly work the mix knob back just a little bit, because on some extent, if it's something like this, again too, this is a very like traditional sounding song, so I don't want it to feel too processed sometimes. So sometimes anytime even if you go back really lightly on your mix knob, whether it's still at only 85 or even 90%, you're still letting through some of that uncompressed, like unfiltered signal, which gives you a little bit more of that, of the actual raw performance that was in there, with still getting all the main stuff from the compressor. So that's just if you hear like something like attacking too much. You know, I might pull it back and it just smooths out the compression just a tad. But you can see I'm not worried on bass, like, you know, I'm not worried about on bass, you know, compressing 5 to 10 dB. That's really going to keep it in its spot. We kind of want the bass to be locked in where it's at in our mixing. So me being in this 5 to 10 range is not. Plus this is adding some character to it as well. Now, once I've gone in and got some compression now going on in this is usually where then I'll go in, and this is where we'll kind of add our final excitement to this, whether I'm adding in, usually Revival's the first thing I try after, because this is an exciter if y'all don't know. So anything that you're trying to literally add excitement to, that's what this Revival is really good for, whether it be vocals or guitars or drums or anything. I mean, it's really good to anything that you're trying to like actually add a little bit of excitement to. So they're going to dial in a little bit of the thickness and a little bit of the high end here too. So you can hear how much low end this adds in the thickness area. So now that's adding a little excitement on there. So this is a pretty quick chain to go through to get you to a pretty solid bass sound from where we started. So from before we put anything in, this is where our bass was at. Cool, so now it's, now it's starting to poke out a lot more in this mix, where you almost couldn't feel it at all before we started mixing and getting the EQ right with everything else that's going on around it. Okay, so now that we've got this area, now there is one other thing, let's say you were, the revival wasn't doing as much as you wanted or something. Another thing, if you're trying to add more low end, I do like the lift after it too, because this can give you lots of, you can make it bigger, like where it feels wider or more punchy from this. You can also add a little more presence in the high end as well. But for the most part, this would be something that's really that could really give you a lot of punch in the low end if you decide to go that route. So those are two, either the lift or the revival are very good at doing that scenario. Cool. So now what we're going to do now is we're going to talk about just a little bit of parallel processing and the busing from here on the second part there. So that's what this is what I've done so far on the first track. Like if I was doing this now, let's say I want to add a little more on with this. A really great way to do this is to simply just duplicate your bass track. So if I go duplicate here, now I don't want any of the alternate playlists, don't want any of the automation, don't want any of the same inserts, don't want any of the sends. I don't believe I have these in a group, so I don't even want to put the group on there. So I'm going to take group assignments off as well and just click OK. And now what it's going to do is it's going to give me a completely blank bass duplicate here that I can process side by side, just like to add extra grit onto this. And now once I've made this second bass, I want to bust these guys together and go ahead and do that. So I'm going to show you how you can do that. I showed y'all earlier in the last week how to make any auxiliaries by yourself, but to make a very quick new bus here, we can go to new track. Because I'm clicking on the output for just one of these, I could actually click output for both of them and hold Shift Option, and then when I click it, it's going to put both of them there. So if I click new track, now it's going to make me a new track. But remember, I was saying this is bass. I want bass to be mono. I want it to be up the middle, even though I have two tracks. So I'm going to make this a mono aux, and I'm going to name it bass bus. Or you can just name it bass. It's whatever you want to label it. That's just what I'm going to call it for this seminar. So now, when it does that, this bass bus is sent here. I just want to make sure this is going to my mix bus now. So that's going in the right place. And now I have both my basses going into this track channel here. And so now, the next things we can kind of do, now this is usually something I'm doing, I almost am always doing this with heavier rock tracks and stuff where you really want the bass to hit hard, is I'm always doing some type of duplicate like this. But there's a couple of different things you can do depending on what you want the duplicate to be. So first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and pull my tape machine back over here to give this side, because remember, again, this is a DI, so it is going to be a little dull sounding until you start doing something to it. You can already hear how that's just already pushing a little bit of life into it and doing that whole scenario. So one thing that's really good to do against a bass is to do a more distorted one next to it, which can fill it out, make it cut a little more, make it feel a little more present. Also, it adds a little more grit. Now, this may be, remember again, this is a segment where I'm really not trying to add a ton of grit to this, but I'm going to show you it anyway. So this is something, let's go back to our and this is going to hit a little bit different in here than the other one because I don't have the Sans amp running in front of this. And that's on purpose because I'm going to drive this with some other options. So Here's one way where you can do it very like old school style, like this is like if you were driving it through a preamp. And this may be something here where this is where I would definitely try to bring in a little more. John is asking, did I solo safe? I use solo safe on the bus here, and that's on any of these where you see the actual S grayed out. I am command clicking on that to solo safe it, and that's just so if I'm soloing between these two in here, no matter, because if I don't have this solo safe on, even if I soloed on one of these tracks, you're not going to hear anything. Because now the bus that it's going to is not soloed. Like you'd have to go click on it physically. But if I command click on this solo safe right here, now I don't have to go anything that's like inside that bus. I don't have to go click solo on every single bus on there, so I can just individually hit tracks and hear everything that it's being processed through. But see, you can get that real fuzzy kind of sound. Now this, again, this would be a very specific sound you're going for. You can get that real fuzzy kind of sound by driving it through like a 1073. That's just like the preamps, kind of like the Heritages and the Vintex we have here in the studio at home. I mean, I don't know why I said home, you know what I mean, your home studio here at the school, for those of you who are, have access to it. It's working just like those, or anyone who has a 1073 preamp. That's basically what this is. I'm just driving it really hard through that. Now that's getting you a little more grit. Another option we can do from this is doing a more parallel processing. So let me just copy that. I'm gonna take this 1073 out. And then this is more like if we wanted to keep it a little more clean, but you still wanted to get a little more presence in the bass to actually punch up a little bit more. I'm using a little bit more gritty, using a little more, well, like a little bit more grit on the, by picking this modern version. And I'm gonna push this even harder than the other one. But it's adding just a lot more attack with how hard I have the compressor going on this. I went to 8-to-1, if you kind of heard there. But I felt like it was doing a little bit too much attack on the pick. Now I want to listen to it with the other bass because I'm going to be blending these together. Now this is a thing too where I would come back in and add a little more low end back into this side of the I just want to hear this one for a second. I just want to get that tone a little bit stronger where I'm getting a little more. So here's with these two, with it just doing parallel compression, which is going to be a lot cleaner than the other way. Which is, you can see how much fuller it makes that bass already sound. And then from there, this is where I'd go in more and control it from my, this is why I have these busts to a new track. So once I have this going on to the bus, then I gotta have the blend I want. Then I can just control where the level is I need it in the mix from my actual bass bus control over here. But let's say if you were listening from the other form of that. Now, another method you can do with this that you can use, like especially if you're just trying to make this very like a little more distorted or more controlled, we can actually use like one of these amp sim controls and just use pedals with it, which, you know, like if I go to overdrive over here and I'm gonna pick the Diode 250 just because I know it's a little, just knowing guitar pedals, like I'm just, as a guitar player, I know what these pedals sound like because these are modeled after real ones. This is modeled after a Boss Blues driver. This is the like the DoD Diode 250, and then this is the Ibanez Tube Screamer that they're copying off here. And you'll kind of listen, like as I dial them in, I'll show you the 3 different sounds that I can get from those. So you can really take like straight like pedals like this and run and use them to use for distortion on basses like this. I mean, this is great for using straight on guitar. You can use it on guitars as well. You can use it on vocals. Like you can use these pedals to do different things. But I'll just kind of show you the difference of what you can even do with these 3 pedals. So that's the 250. That's the Blues driver. And this is the Tube Screamer, which is much, much grittier. Just a lot grittier with that. This is just a lot smoother down there. So but that saturation we're putting on there, especially blending that in with those, is definitely what gives us these different sounds. So here's kind of some different, listening to the different parallels we have going next to that. So this is just a pedal running through it. And this is just parallel compression happening through it. So it's cleaner, but still punchy. And then this is like more fuzz style coming through. We're actually driving like preamp gain through it. Get this setting in the mix. So that is some different, on this one, like I said, I'm not choosing to do grit, so I ended up not using the pedal or the one where I'm driving it through the fuzz sound because of the tone of this song. But this is a very easy way for you to get multiple thicker, bigger bass and be able to do different types of processing for depending on what you need. Now I am using the VTM on both these to keep the low end in there and give it that little feel. So just keep that in mind. And then on these I'm running the virtual channel too. You could absolutely run the virtual channel before this pedal too if you didn't want to have either of these running through, or you could even, but you see, like if you compress that much, running into one of those, like because I'm using the drive kind of on the other one to. But this would be the choice that for this track, more where I would go with it is more of a parallel compression that keeps it a little bit cleaner to blend in with more of the vibe of this track, where it's not gritty and very distorted at all. So here's just kind of the starting point from where this bass came from. So this is where we had at the beginning. Then we added our console emulation, our VTM. Then brought in a second parallel unit there. Then I have those bussed together into a single mono bus over here to be able to keep all that information in the center, and then we have an easy control for the blend that we have over here to put exactly where we want it in the mix. You could also, other options for this, just so y'all know, like you could choose any distortion or overdrive that you like. Other good ones, just as we're talking about this, Sound Toys Decapitator is obviously great for this kind of stuff. And you can actually even push a bunch of low end through this too. Which I don't really want a low cut. So you can see how you can, like there's super fuzz when you punish it. And these are just different styles that you can control the tone. So Decapitator is another option, and then even if you don't have any of these tools and you're using the stock stuff, you can absolutely use the Avid stock distortion or lo-fi or any of those. Let me see, I believe the distortion is just going to be that. Oh, that's the kilohertz one, which you could use that as well. But if you go the lo-fi one right here, that's the Avid built in, this is perfect for adding saturation to stuff. You literally have the saturation knob right here, which even that, you can hear the thickness is going to make it sound better on smaller speakers. So where that actually distorts it more on that front. So you can kind of hear it a little bit. Punished it for sure. Punished is always a wild one, so you got to make sure you're actually doing, you want to make sure that's exactly what you're looking for. So again, this is how I, like, in general, like I said, you can take these different statements that I'm saying and apply them to the type of genre or the song that you are specifically working with. But in general, like the frequency ranges that we talked about at the beginning with your low end, your tone and roundness in the 100 to 250, where the mud regions are, where the presence is from 1 to 2.5K, and from the brightness from the 5K up, all that's going to be the same because that's the frequency range of the instrument. And you can apply that to any genre. Then going through, and this is how I like to process bass and get the low end held together and then send it to a mono bass bus and blend it all together. So this is how, this was me going through a track that, you know, taking the bass from scratch and adding a little mix through there and then adding some parallel to the side, whether that was compression or distortion, and I chose compression to keep it clean, and then have them both go into the mono bus. So that is me mixing bass. I hope that helps everyone out a little bit more on your takes on bass whenever you're using your own mixes, and that is how I would do that. So thank you guys so much for watching. We will see you next time, and y'all have a great rest of your evening. Later.
Thanks everybody for watching. If you found this content useful, please like this video. It will tell YouTube to show it to others. If you are enrolled, please go to the Seminars tab on the my.trcoa website and take the quiz over tonight's lesson. And if you need to book one-on-one time with an instructor, text 512-231-0344. If you aren't enrolled, go to trcoa.edu to find out more information about what we do. Also, please post in the chat subjects you'd like to see for our upcoming live streams. And as always, subscribe to our channel, and we'll see you guys on the flip side. Bye, everybody.